This is a very large piece of web art I've put up on the internet. There are 7 wheels with different letters inscribed on each wheel, and the letters all have different meanings. You can turn the wheels with the dials that I have below and put certain letters in alignment with other letters, like this. As you combine them, you are creating different concepts or strings depending on which glyph is lined up with the other glyphs. When you go up here, you can choose your subject glyph and see the strings that you're making. I have a small problem here. I want mountain, the symbol for mountain is the triangle, to line up with the symbol for sky. So I move the wheel a bit and I create a new string. Now I'm going to give that concept a name. I've decided Sky Mountain Seed and Flag should be called Monastery, so I type that in the bar and hit Submit. I've now created a new concept. When I go down back to my subject character, I can click on that and open up the encyclopedia, which stores every single concept made under mountain. Unfortunately, Monastery hasn't shown up yet, but there is Vogue, which was made by Professor Kohler, involving a word that's colloquially in Hawaiian English. Now I'm going to refresh this page, and Monastery has shown up. So if I click on this link here, I go right to the encyclopedia page, and I create a new article defining what a monastery is in the terms of my glyphs that are right there, that was created at a specific place upon my wheel. So I'm saying a monastery is a place where monks live, and I've created a new page. That is a really brief example of how this system is supposed to work, combining hieroglyphs and an encyclopedia. The demonstration I just did really doesn't cover what this thing is, what it's for, what it's supposed to do. I have other videos where I explain how this thing works. I'm not going to do that here. Instead, I'm going to try to tell the history behind this thing that will hopefully reveal a little bit more of what it is, how it functions, what it's supposed to do, and even actually why it exists. After we go on this adventure, you may be able to understand what this thing does and how to use it a little bit better. This is a computer from the 13th century. Written on the inside of the circle are Christian virtues. On the outside circle are letters. The 3 circles combine to be able to create the sum total of what is thinkable. This is a combinatorial logic system that was called the Ars Magna, the Great Art, and it was invented by one man, Raymond Lull. Raymond Lull was born in 1232 or 1233 in Palma, the capital of Majorca. For the first 30 years of his life, Lull's career seemed to be pretty average, although he was comparatively well off. He was a troubadour at the court of James I. He had a wife and children. Like all troubadours, his job was to write poetry for the court, and the style at the time was unrequited courtly love in the theme of Guinevere and Lancelot. This was all fine for him. He spent his days going to parties and living the whole hog, until one day a rather startling event happened to him. Raymond, while still a young man and seneschal to the King of Majorca, was very given to composing worthless songs and poems and to doing other licentious things. One night he was sitting beside his bed, about to compose and write in his vulgar tongue a song to a lady whom he loved with a foolish love, and as he began to write this song, he looked to his right and saw our Lord Jesus Christ on the cross, as if suspended in mid-air. This sight filled him with fear, and, leaving what he was doing, he retired to bed and went to sleep. Upon arising the next day, he returned to his usual vanities without giving the vision a further thought. It was not until almost a week later, however, in the same place as before, and at almost exactly the same hour, when he was again preparing to work on and finish the aforementioned song, that our Lord appeared to him on the cross just as before. He was even more frightened than the first time, and retired to bed, and fell asleep, as he had done before. He had this vision 5 times, and he understood it as teaching him the vanity of his worldly life as a troubadour, and he resolved to dedicate himself to God. At this time, Majorca was a great maritime empire founded upon the Catalan people. Lull resolved that he would go and attempt to unite the Muslims and the Christians, with whom the Majorcans had many business dealings. He wished to create a way for all 3 of the revealed religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, to become one. This was the beginning of the Ars Magna, a combinatorial art that was designed to teach people of all 3 religions that the virtues that were taught by those religions were shared. In this diagram, you can see that the trees have concepts attached to them, and the leaves were thought of as virtues such as goodness and greatness, which were combined to describe the essential attributes of God. In the book of the Gentile and the 3 Wise Men, Lull writes, "The first tree, on which you see 21 flowers, represent God and his essential uncreated virtues, which virtues are written on the flowers, as you can see. This tree has, among others, 2 conditions. One is that one must always attribute to and recognize in God the greatest nobility in essence, in virtues, and in action. The other condition is that the flowers not be contrary to one another, nor one be less than another." Although at the beginning of his journey Lull was consumed by fear, ultimately he mastered himself and journeyed to the land of the Muslims, risking imprisonment and death multiple times in order to attempt to convince them of the usefulness of his art. Simultaneously, he attempted to convince the Pope that his art should be adopted and the 3 religions should become one. Unfortunately, he was not able to convince Christendom either. This sorting through of all the possible combinations of all of the virtues inherent in the being of God was ultimately represented as a wheel, where the letters were combined with virtues to go through all of the different combinations. This was a simpler way to represent it than trees, but was not often presented to people when Lull was first presenting the art, in order to teach of the unity of all religions. At the center of this wheel was always the letter A, which was never used on the outside, applying only to God. Today, historians of computer science recognize the Ars Magna as being the first dedicated syntactic language that would perform computations, which is why Raymond Lull's thinking machine, as it's been called in modern times, has received a unique spot in the history of computing. You can now see where I got the idea for the wheels. They're a direct reference to the Ars Magna of Raymond Lull. Although there are slightly more wheels on my system than his, you can also see how characters are inscribed at points along the wheel to represent concepts, and it's combinatorial in the sense that when you combine characters, letters, as in Lull's system, you create new concepts. But the big difference here is that my characters are Egyptian hieroglyphs, which are meant to represent a new conceptual writing system, different from hieroglyphs in the past. So where does that come from? That seems like a rather random idea to put hieroglyphs on these spinning wheels. This is perhaps the most bizarre and ludicrous art object the Baroque artist Bernini ever produced. On the top is a pilfered obelisk from the 26th dynasty of Egypt. On the bottom is an elephant. What could possibly have been going through their minds to perform this weird, culturally appropriative act? Every bad idea comes from somewhere, apparently, and in this case, it came from literature. But behind that lingers an even more interesting story. Meet Horapollo, one of the last Egyptian priests, who in the 5th century wrote a book about hieroglyphs in Greek. This book was the end result of a long process of hieroglyphic innovation by the priests of Egypt, involving subterfuge, cryptography, and elaborate allegorical interpretation of existing signs. It's also the last relic of a dying culture, because Horapollo didn't fully know how to read the hieroglyphs himself. The first few entries in the book have genuine Greek descriptions that seem to represent some actual knowledge of Egyptian literature. But then, gradually, Horapollo gets drunk. He insists, for instance, that the symbol for calendar in Egyptian was a man eating an hourglass, a ridiculous symbol that never existed. Bizarre to contemplate, it's unclear if these hieroglyphs came from the genuine Horapollo or a later interpolation. Regardless, this book had a big impact on how the Renaissance viewed hieroglyphs, who thought that it was genuine and that they had deciphered the secret to Egyptian writing. They were so confident that hieroglyphs were nothing more than allegories that they began to invent their own hieroglyphs to tell new stories. They quickly discovered, like in all pictorial writing systems, that they needed some phonetic elements. Leon Battista Alberti proposed using a caption or a legend which would explain the meaning. His winged eye famously became a hieroglyphic form of his signature, containing the motto Quid Tum, which means, so what? These hieroglyphic inscriptions had a great influence on Colonna's Hypnerotomachia Polyphilii, a book about the sleep of Brother Polyphilio. And from this, Leon Battista Alberti's obelisk on top of an elephant was born. What happened was interesting. In their insistence that Horapollo was a genuine translation of the hieroglyphs, Europeans had essentially invented an alternate Egypt that existed only in their imaginations. Veiled in mystique and also prejudice, the important thing about this is it created a new idea about hieroglyphs and even a new hieroglyphic tradition based on the misinterpretations of the Greeks. In this new conception, hieroglyphs were entirely ideal or allegorical forms that could be used by anyone to convey metaphors. Thus, the idea of a universal hieroglyphic language was born. It was Egyptian hieroglyphs themselves that were that language. Okay, so that explains the spinning wheels and the hieroglyphs, but what about the other part? What about the encyclopedia? Where did that idea come from? Our story continues with a man named Giordano Bruno, a Dominican monk who was burned at the stake and is today considered a martyr for science. Bruno drew on both the hieroglyphic and the Lullian traditions to create his great work, the Clavis Magna, the Great Keys of Nature, a massive memory wheel that combined hieroglyphs with Lullian combinatorics to represent anything that could be known. This work has often been criticized as being too complicated to understand, but it does have a very important position in the history of science. Bruno was tragically burned at the stake for a number of reasons, not least of which was that he believed that the Earth went around the Sun and that there were other planets. He also believed that because there were an infinite number of planets in an infinite universe, Jesus Christ must have come to each one of those planets and redeemed them, and that on every single one of those planets, there must have been a pope. As you can imagine, the Catholic Church did not like the idea of an infinite number of holy sees contesting its authority. The Church accused him of something which we would today call pantheism, the idea that God and nature are one. In truth, Bruno probably wasn't really a pantheist proper, but he influenced people who came after him, who truly were full-on pantheists and even atheists. The death of Bruno sent a shockwave across Europe, which came with a kind of backlash, as intellectuals and Protestants doubled down on their calls for freedom of thought. Perhaps it would have been better for the Church if they had never burned Bruno at all, because many of his ideas caught on. One of the people whom Bruno influenced was Francis Bacon. It was clear from the actions of Copernicus, Bruno, and Galileo, and people like them, that the time had come for a new science. Bruno had been calling for a new science and even a new philosophy, more similar to the old, completely outside of the role of the Church. What people didn't know was how to proceed in this. Bacon proposed a technique called the novum organon, and an institution of peer review that could ground modern science, all of which we still use to this day. Today, we call the novum organon the scientific method, which is what we learn in school, being creating a hypothesis, test your hypothesis, achieve your results, then repeat the process. But Bacon also wrote a lot about hieroglyphs, which he called real characters. This was definitely influenced by the hieroglyphic tradition we just discussed, but also was impacted by Europeans' discovery of China, which was a new land for them in the 17th century. Bacon was not a fan of the Lullian art, calling it an art for jugglers, but he was deeply influenced by the hieroglyphic tradition. For him, real characters were purely conventional, and referred in a direct way to the thing signified, representing neither letters nor words, but things or notions. The draw for him in this was that a book composed of real characters could be read and understood by people belonging to different linguistic groups and speaking different languages, provided that the conventional meanings of the various ideograms were established in advance. This idea would later influence John Wilkins and would become more important around the time of the Royal Society, but for now we're going to go across the pond and consider another philosopher in the Czech Republic. John Amos Comenius. Comenius was a visionary Protestant reformer who called for a system of pansophia, or universal wisdom. You can be grateful to Comenius because he is the first person who proposed that we should have high school, and that is one of the reasons why you will have spent your adolescent years studying things rather than working in a coal mine. But Comenius's goals for education were much more ambitious than what has been realized even today. He wanted to create a universal system of education that could work for all people of all ages and would combine all of the arts and sciences. This is the meaning of the word pansophy. To achieve that end, he explicitly called for the creation of a universal language. For both Comenius and Bacon, this idea of the universal language would be attached to a universal encyclopedia and would also give rise to a real institution, a whole new kind of university. In the 1660s, that university was ready to be founded, and it was called the Royal Society in England. And now we come to the most important part. This is the split between the Comenian and the Baconian ideas of science, a split that is with us to this day. Comenius was a much younger man than Bacon, being a generation younger, and outlived him. Bacon died in the 1620s. Comenius lived well into the late 17th century. At the founding of the Royal Society, Comenius was called to England to be sponsored by the Crown to help them with educational reform, because he was recognized as being the greatest expert in Europe on this topic. Everyone agreed that it was time to put Bacon's ideas into practice and to build the Royal Society. There were, however, two groups that were involved with the process of creating the society and were competing over which direction modern science would go. There was the Hartleap Circle that was more Comenian, and Gresham College that wanted to take a more strictly Baconian approach. Both groups agreed in the aims of the new science and the Royal Society. It was supposed to reach a greater understanding of nature through its interpretation. And also, in both groups, there was an ambition to produce a universal language and a universal encyclopedia. The conflict really came in the means to that end. Comenius wanted to create a universal pansophy that would integrate all the arts and sciences into one. Bacon's entire method was based on a strict delineation between the natural sciences, the humanities, and the arts. The Baconian group won out, and their vision of the Royal Society was what went forward, and that is why we have a split in the arts and sciences today. But while the ideal university Comenius was looking for never materialized, he and Bacon had more in common than it might seem at first glance. In Bacon's work, The Silva Silvarum, he called for a new kind of encyclopedia that would be composed of tables of natural history. This natural history has been largely ignored by contemporary scholars, but the curious thing about it is that to Bacon, the Universal Encyclopedia Project was actually more important than the scientific method itself. He writes, "It comes therefore to this, that my organum, even if it were completed, would not without the natural history much advance the instauration of the sciences, whereas the natural history without the organum would advance it not a little." Per the program, both Bacon and Comenius were proposing the point of the scientific method, and the gathering of information about nature was to compile it within one universal resource that anyone could consult. And this universal resource has not yet materialized. But in the past 400 years, there have been many attempts. John Wilkins was the first to attempt to create a universal language out of Baconian real characters that would also serve as this universal encyclopedia. Leibniz continued this idea in the Comenian tradition on the continent, creating the much more famous Characteristica Universalis, which has had a huge influence to this day. Unfortunately, while Leibniz produced a great deal of material, he has such a vast volume of work, it's unclear whether he ever actually produced a physical copy of his universal character. 100 years later, influenced by these people, Denis Diderot would attempt the Encyclopédie in Paris. This was directly in conversation with Leibnizian ideas, and was the pinnacle of the Enlightenment attempt to actually realize the universal encyclopedia. Unfortunately, it was a failure. There was simply too much information to record. Coming forward to the present day, in the 1880s, Gottlob Frege produced the Begriffsschrift, which was a universal logical language meant to exist in the tradition of Leibniz's Characteristica, following some of the remarks he made about logical connectives. This is a very important language that has influenced mathematics and philosophy, and similar languages to this are still used to this day. Indeed, in the 400 years since a universal language has been proposed, combined with a universal encyclopedia, hundreds upon hundreds of people have attempted to create one. Often, there's a new person who creates a universal language every single year. You could say that we are closer to the ideal of a universal encyclopedia than ever before. The dreams of Bacon and Comenius have almost been realized. Wikipedia exists. It's massive, it's free, it's open, and anyone can edit it. What's lacking is only a universal character language that could unite everything into one notation system. This idea is known to Stephen Wolfram at Wolfram Alpha, who has called for a Characteristica Universalis in the tradition of Leibniz, but to him, this in practice means applications of computer programming to computational law. If we look at the situation today, we're actually closer to realizing the dream of the Enlightenment than ever before. Bacon's natural history was supposed to be composed of tables, a notation system very similar to modern databasing techniques. However, we still lack the root of this, which has always been a language composed of real characters which can represent ideas, drawing on the misinterpretation of the hieroglyphic tradition. That's what this attempts to be. The internet gives us a unique opportunity to work with software similar to Wikipedia to finally achieve this aim. These glyphs on these spinning wheels reference the past, but it's a version of a prototype of what a future language like this could look like. But wait, what about Comenius? His idea for a universally integrated academy where all of the subjects were taught as one was never fulfilled. We never achieved Pan-Sophia. Perhaps, using modern computational methods, we can finally heal the rift between the art and sciences and create a universal language that's not only universal across all language groups, but also across all academic disciplines.
The fact of script and the ability to make inventories and collect data and store data changed many social habits and processes back as early as 3000 BC. However, that's about as early as scripts began. The effects of rearranging one's experience, organizing one's experience by these new extensions of our powers, are quite unexpected. Perhaps one way of putting it is to say that writing represents a high degree of specializing of our powers.
Yes.
Compared to pre-literate societies, there is a considerable concentration on one faculty when you develop a skill like scripting.
And this is the visual, what you call the visual.
Yes,
faculty.
this is a highly specialized stress compared to anything in ordinary oral societies. There have been many studies made of this in various ways. But in our own Western world, the rise of the phonetic alphabet seems to have had much to do with Platonic culture and the ordering of experience in the terms of ideas, classifying of data and experience by ideas.
The vision of the future that your book could leave one with is one in a big brother image, in a sense. You speak of for example, programming cultures. For instance, you say that if the South African scene looks like getting too hot because of an overdose of radio, we program a lot of television, cool them off. This kind of interference with what the typographical literate man calls human rights.
We have never stopped interfering drastically with ourselves by every technology we could latch onto. We have absolutely disrupted
and you think this might
our lives over and over again.
Lead us into a kind of electric totalitarianism?
I think no. I think the logic, if unimpeded, the logic of this sort of electric world is stasis.
Yes. And out of this, forgive me for interrupting again.
Yes.
I was going to ask you, where do you see, is there a terminus, or should we always go from the thesis of typography to the...
I think if there is a logic, and a hopeful one, that appears in this, it is the dispelling of all unconscious aspects of our lives altogether, that we, in order to live with ourselves in such depth, in such instant feedback situations, we have to understand everything, so that our easygoing lolling about in the lap of the unconscious cannot endure. That we will have to take over the total human environment as an artifact. But it seems to be forced upon us. The need to become completely autonomous and aware of all the consequences of everything we're doing before the consequences occur is where we're heading.